Good afternoon, my friends. This is Paul, and today I'm going to be re-reviewing The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker HD for the Wii U, this time with video footage. When I originally reviewed Wind Waker HD, I thought of it quite favorably, as it was a solid Zelda adventure that had some not-so-solid pacing that was fixed tremendously on the Wii U version, so that it was much more tolerable. This time around, my feelings were definitely a bit more mixed. I do overall still think it's a good game, just not quite as good as I remember it. So just in case you've already played Wind Waker on the GameCube and are wondering what changes were brought to the Wii U version, we'll go over those first before we get into the game as a whole. One of the biggest new features is that sailing is now much faster. In the original game, you would have to equip a sail while you were on your talking boat, the King of Red Lions. Then you'd have to use the Wind Waker, which also needed to be equipped, to play a song to change the wind's direction so that it was pointing the way you wanted to go. Then you had to keep pausing to check if you were on the right track or not. Then you'd have to turn around if you wanted to change directions and change the wind, and it was a real hassle. Now you can just get an item called the Swift Sail, which lets you sail doubly fast. You're always at maximum speed no matter which way you're turning, so that drastically decreases the amount of times you need to play the Wind Requiem. But the problem with it is that it's kind of hard to discover how to get it. What you have to do is you have to find one of the fishmen and feed it bait, and then the fishman tells you to go to Windfall Island at night and win the Swift Sail in an auction. But how is the average player supposed to know which island gives that particular tip? I actually had to look it up online because I was like, the King of Red Lions isn't telling me squat. He's just telling me to hurry up and get on with it. But I don't want to get on with it. I want to sail faster because that's the selling point of the game. Regardless, now that I told you, that should prevent you from having to scour the sea for hints, and you can just get right to the Swift Sail. Another big change is the addition of a new item called the Tingle Bottle. Well, it was big at the time, but now that Miiverse was discontinued, it's totally useless. In the original game, you got an item called the Tingle Tuner, which let a second player play as Tingle on the Game Boy Advance, while the person on the GameCube controlled Link. And it was a very interesting way of incorporating co-op play in a Zelda game, but this new item literally does nothing, whereas you could still go back to the GameCube version if you had a Game Boy Advance and a GameCube to GBA Link cable, whereas now it just takes up space in your inventory and it takes up a whole slot on your gamepad. Speaking of the gamepad, you can play the game off TV on the gamepad, and there's no significant stuttering as far as I could tell. Sometimes the game naturally stutters if there's too much on the screen, but that was a problem on the GameCube version to begin with. And I think it was deliberate because they wanted to emphasize when Link made a really powerful blow, so I guess I can kind of forgive it, especially as it only happened maybe like twice or 3 times during my playthrough. You can use the gamepad also as like a second screen when you're playing on the TV to use the stylus or your finger to drag items onto the right buttons, to open the bags with the press of a button, to switch to the map tab. Also, when you're sailing, you can see the icon of where Link is on the Great Sea chart while you're moving instead of having to constantly pause the game. You can also see the notes to Wind Waker songs on the gamepad, and you can also move the gamepad's gyro sensor to use projectile weapons, which really helps speed things along. In addition to that, you can also move around while using projectile items, which really helps out on those boss battles, especially one of the later ones. There's a hero mode that's readily available when you start up the game. You don't have to unlock it like you did in Skyward Sword, and you can keep turning it on and off. You don't have to have a whole playthrough in normal mode or hero mode. You can, if you find that it's too hard, you can just turn it off. What hero mode does is it doubles the amount of damage you take, and it prevents you from getting hearts. The only way to recover your energy is to drink a potion, use a fairy, or have yourself healed. Finally, the last 2 major upgrades I wanted to tell you guys are the graphics have been slightly overhauled so that there's a new lighting engine and the characters look slightly more like Play-Doh figures. They don't really change their proportions at all. I'm not the biggest fan of Wind Waker's graphic style to begin with, but at least it's slightly more tolerable since the lighting makes things look ever so slightly more realistic. And there's also better draw distance, so it's easier to see things. Then there's also that late game fetch quest that everyone hated, that drained your rupees, required you to grind, and forced you to find items that would help you find other items, but the tracking items wouldn't work until you paid a character to make them usable. Then, after you tracked down the item, there's the question of getting it, and it was obviously padding because there's a lot of evidence to suggest that Wind Waker was rushed and a lot of dungeons were actually cut from the game. So, in this new version, you get most of those items automatically and you only need 3 tracking items. Still would have been better if they just got rid of the tracking items altogether, but at least they have far less of them now. And they also made your wallets bigger so that it's easier to farm for the rupees that you need. Now, onto what is the Wind Waker. At its core, Wind Waker is a traditional Zelda game with a non-traditional coat of paint. At the time Wind Waker was revealed, it was initially shown off to be a very realistic looking game, by 2000 standards that is, where adult Link would be facing off against Ganondorf in a one-to-one sword fight, and it looked incredible, again, by its time, compared to what Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask could do. But then, when they changed direction to make it the cel-shaded look, people lost their minds in the worst way possible, including me. Nowadays, I think people are more accepting of this because Nintendo games around the Wii era started shifting away from realistic graphics to be more stylized. I still don't really like the graphics. They feel too cartoony and unrealistic, especially when they exaggerate certain character traits, such as a boy that has trouble wiping his nose, where he has the snot that's taller than his body. Ugh, that kind of stuff just grosses me out. And the fact that the characters don't have feet. Like, was it really that hard to animate a person walking? That being said, a lot of people have expressed that Wind Waker's graphics, even on the original hardware, have made the game age better than most other games of the GameCube era, and I guess I can kind of agree, as the new graphic style does allow the characters to be much more expressive. Link in particular emotes so much more than he's ever done, and to this day even future Zelda games don't have him show as much emotion. He'll jump up and down after you beat a boss battle, he'll struggle if he's put into a trap, he'll move his eyes to look at enemies in the distance, and there's just so many little touches that feel like even though he doesn't really talk, he still has his own personality quirks. Wind Waker is split into 3 basic sections: exploration, dungeon crawling, and sailing. The sailing is the part of the game that people had the most mixed opinions on, as it's a cool concept that you have this huge, giant open ocean where you can go pretty much wherever you want once you've beaten the first dungeon, and you'd find different islands to explore, and you'd eventually map out your sea chart, but you'd be at the mercy of the wind, as mentioned in the changes earlier. And even with the swift sail, sometimes sailing can be a bit tedious, as there's not really a whole lot to do in between the islands. Sometimes barrels will pop up that have rupees on them, sometimes you'll jump over sharks, but other than that, it's mainly just a loading screen in disguise is the most polite way of looking at it. That being said, the music that plays when you're sailing is really amazing. It's not exactly orchestral, but it gets the job done. In fact, in this Wind Waker HD remaster, why did I say that? I should have just said this remake. They actually remastered all of the music tracks, so the Great Sea sounds even more majestic than it originally did. Once you get on land, the experience gets a little bit more mixed, as there are some islands that are decent to explore, such as Outset Island, Windfall Island, and Dragon Roost Island. Oh my gosh, that music is amazing. But most of the islands are actually pretty boring and don't offer a lot of incentive to go out of your way to do the side quests, especially since a lot of the side quests involve searching for treasure underneath the Great Sea, which is kind of a pain in the neck, especially if the reward is like 1 rupee. Once you're in the dungeons, that's when things feel more like a traditional Zelda game. But my biggest problem is that the dungeons themselves are so boring. Majora's Mask has by far my favorite dungeons in the Zelda series, and Wind Waker seemed like they dialed it down significantly. Pretty much all of the dungeons can be boiled down to go in a straight line, get the major item, go back to a new area to use that item, and then go in another straight line to get to the boss. There's not really a whole lot of exploration. It's a very linear process, and usually the puzzles aren't that great. The solutions are often really obvious. And you don't even get a true Zelda dungeon until the second one, as the first dungeon you encounter, the Forsaken Fortress, has Link sneaking around past guards because his sword got dropped to the highest tower. It feels very slow-paced, especially when the opening was relatively slow. Not as bad as Twilight Princess HD, but still, you can't really skip the cutscenes in this game, so on repeat playthroughs, things can definitely get a bit grating. It's even more annoying that when you try to skip the cutscenes, the game makes an error sound, almost as if it knows that you want to skip the cutscenes and is making fun of you for not waiting a couple of years for Twilight Princess and Skyward Sword to fix that. I think Wind Waker's dungeons thematically are decent, but they don't have a good payoff. They feel like the puzzles are too telegraphed. One thing that is really strong about Wind Waker is its combat. Link's animations are very flashy, and the game prioritizes knowing when to dodge and when to hold up your shield. And the enemies usually do a decent job of putting up a relatively good fight. There's a new parry attack mechanic where if you press the A button at just the right time, Link will leap out of the way of the enemy's attack and offer a counterattack. Sometimes these counterattacks are the only effective way of finishing off an enemy. There's also a couple of new enemy behaviors that have carried over to the combat in general, such as being able to knock an enemy down. They're invincible when this happens, so there's no finishing blow like in Twilight Princess. You can also sometimes steal the enemy's weapons, which are really clumsy to use, so I tried to avoid this as much as possible. And sometimes they can hit other enemies, which makes fighting in groups much easier. And they sometimes drop these orbs that drop a bunch of items once you slash them open, meaning that it's much easier to stock up on rupees and hearts and collectibles. Overall, I think Wind Waker is a decent game. Not as terrific as I remembered it being, as I didn't like the dungeons. I wished there was more to explore outside the main objectives, and I also wish the game didn't have as much repetition and backtracking and that annoying side quest at the end, even though it's been significantly sped up, still just feels like a giant padded waste of time. But it does have a really good story, it has amazing combat, and it has a truly incredible final battle and an excellent payoff in the ending. But maybe if the dungeons had been better designed and the open world concept was a lot more fleshed out, this could have been one of the all-time greats. It's still better than most of the 2D Zelda games in my opinion, but all of the other 3D Zelda games are much better. I think I even like Skyward Sword better than this game, and that's saying something. So with that, thank you very much for watching. Let me know down in the comments if you have any questions and what you thought about the video. Special thanks to my patrons Matthew Rakowski, Spoon Ghost, Splatcat, and Scooter Doodle for supporting me. The link will be in the description if you'd like to join. And until the next time, remember to keep the faith, stay epic, and God bless. Bye!